Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is Thursday, August 18th, and we are here at the second half of week three with a discussion of a new round of topics. We're really going to get into how the music is actually functioning in the game. We're going this discussion here in week three will kind of lead us towards more of the technical side of things in week four as we talk about some of the software that's involved and some of the tools that are actually used to get your music working in the game. But before that, we're going to talk more in sort of the conceptual and idea phase of how your music is actually, or how does the computer control your music. We'll take it from the point of view of you have been working on a game project and building up a series of assets, building up minutes worth of music ready to go into a game, and piece by piece you are creating the soundtrack and plugging holes at different points along the process of or the timeline of the game. So last week we discussed how you might start out with a new game project, some of the tools that might be necessary that you can get your hands on to get started on a project. How do you figure out what type of music it might be? We talked about different game genres. We talked about where the music might go in a timeline of a game and different concepts and ideas that you can attach your music to. So when you get started with a new game project, you start determining all of the different aspects that are going to need to be represented by music. And then generally, you don't start writing music for a very particular spot in the game. That typically reveals itself over time. But you start writing music for large ideas, emotions, characters, locations, storylines. You know that there's going to be a big twist in the story three quarters of the way through. You're going to write for big general ideas, but how it's going to fit, how long the file is going to be, maybe how it's going to loop and change and transition and interact. A lot of that stuff is determined later on as the game is developed. But if you haven't established large themes and ideas of instrumentation and character and storyline, then when it actually comes down to chopping it all up and making it fit in the game, you won't have a lot of material to work with, and you'll be kind of rushed along the process. So often there is a period of time where you are just generating music for the sake of the concepts in the game, and then typically later on, but often simultaneously, while you are writing new music, you're going back and taking previous ideas and reworking them in your DAW to make them fit in the game. Because they'll say, hey, we have a new level, or we have a new character, or we have a new part of the game world that needs music. And you can hopefully pluck an idea from this kind of catalog of things that you've created and start manipulating it to fill in that space. So while we kind of started out with figuring out the skeleton of or the structure of what your music soundtrack is going to be, hopefully through that process you start generating a lot of ideas and at least a strong starting point to work from. And over time, well, when you start out with a long list of to-do and a small folder of completed or done or approved files. And over time, you create a new piece of music, you send it off to the client, they say yes or no, they kind of hem and haw over it and say, I like this part, I don't like that part, and you go back and through a series of revisions, you start refining what it's actually going to be and where it ultimately fits in the game. But over time, your pile of to-do gets smaller and smaller, and your pile of done and approved, or your folder filled with WAV files, gets larger and larger. And those files eventually need to start working their way into the game. So a lot of composers there, or a lot of projects they work on, their responsibilities end with the delivery of the approved WAV files. A lot of times, your job as the audio designer, as the music composer, is going to be delivering the WAV files. You email it or Dropbox or upload it to an FTP or a server somewhere. And as long as everybody agrees that this is what's to be delivered, then you have fulfilled the contract. In other cases, you actually start working with the development team and the technology to actually make it work in the game. And so what we're going to get into this afternoon is what is the music doing in the game, and functionality wise, design wise, and then what are some of the ideas and concepts in the actual game that is manipulating your music. Like, what is it actually in the game that takes your WAV file and plays it back correctly? So far, you've worked on 2D platformer. Actually, you've started on all three of the projects: 2D platformer, Angry Bots, and now Palace of Arinthalion. And in each one of them, they have a different approach to the music. Fundamentally, you're just delivering a series of WAV files and screenshots and video captures, but really just the WAV files that are actually working in the game. And those, with each game, the use of those WAV files is different. We know from the project and the documentation and all of the material provided with it that the WAV files are used in a particular way. Like in 2D platformer, you had to set up a series of intro WAV files, main loop WAV files, and ending WAV files. The documentation, the project, I told you how everything is going to be set up, and you created and generated the music for that. And same thing through Angry Bots and now through Palace of Arinthalion. But what we're going to talk about now is really, how does the game know what to do with all of those files? We as the composers, we have all the ideas and we come up with the music and we know how it's supposed to work, but how do we tell the computer or tell somebody else to tell the computer exactly how the music is going to play back? How does the game know when to switch from intro to main loop to ending? Or how does the game know when to switch between ambient and action? So we're going to go not all the way into the software and the actual process and workflow. That's what we're going to get into in week 4. This is more of the conceptual ideas, and I'll relate a lot of this to mixing an album and mixing music for a final album or product, and relate it to that sort of technical process. There is a mixture of creative steps and technical steps in the process of, well, an album, a film, and a game, and it all depends on how all that stuff works together. So let's get into just some of the general functionality of music, or game music, some of the things that are more general that music does in film and theater and music for music's sake, and then what does it do more specifically in the interactive nature of a video game. So first thing here, music conveys emotion. And this should be pretty straightforward. This is one of the most basic aspects of what music is doing in your video game or in your film or in your television show or story or whatever it is. This has its roots back to theater and opera and stage, and music is there to pull at the heartstrings of the listener. That is there to often tell or inform the listener how to feel about a particular situation. The dialogue tells the story. The sound effects tell the information, exactly the kind of facts of what's going on around you. And then the music is often playing towards the listener's emotions. And they use that to ride the ups and downs and the twists and turns in the storyline to give the player that sort of feedback. That's very, very common, and just hopefully a kind of the default nature of what music is doing in all of these forms of media. But a bit more specific to games is music as a state of mind, music that gets you connected directly to the game experience, hopefully as quickly and cleanly as possible. This is a bit of the idea that you are playing a scary game and it's past midnight and all the lights are off and you're directly zoned in on the game and listening to all the music and sound, and you're completely drawn in, and then somebody walks in, flips the lights on, and you freak out and throw the controller across the room because you were just kind of in that zone. You were focused in on the experience, the fact that you don't necessarily feel or consider that you're sitting on your couch in your living room and you're pressing buttons on a controller, just giving that connection more into the game. And the music can do this very well, often through rhythm and repetition is a traditional way that music puts people in that connected state or in that zone with whatever they are listening to. So it is understanding how your music is sort of related to the gameplay and the connectivity of the listener. The next one here is music as a world builder, and this is putting your listener or the player in a particular location or area of the world or culture or time period, placing the listener in the setting of the story as cleanly as possible, as readily as possible. You can do this often very quickly through music, sometimes even more quickly than the image. A lot of movies start out this way. It starts out at black, and you hear sounds of the environment that you are in, and it slowly fades into black, and maybe it's on a close-up, and you're not necessarily sure what's going on, but you hear the sounds of the environment around them, and then quickly the picture reveals what is actually going on. But music is, through your choice of genre and style and instrumentation, kind of speaks to how you are creating the world, and you are supporting the images, you're supporting the sound effects, and all the music can certainly feed into this very, very well. And we have the advantage, the image here, this part of the slide. This is a excuse me. This is a presentation from Microsoft on the HoloLens, which is using a version of augmented reality. This person can only see this computer-generated image along with the camera, right along with this, but it is a kind of it's not virtual reality because it's actually placed over the real world onto a physical table. So, but it is all just projected through the goggles that they have on, that he has on his head. So there's a quite an interesting push now in the game industry into virtual reality and augmented reality. There's the Oculus Rift, and PlayStation just announced a PlayStation VR headset. There is also the HTC Vive. This is the Microsoft HoloLens. All of these things that are really new technology where they said, hey, we invented this box that if you put it on your head and you basically put it directly over your eyes, it makes you feel like you're in that environment. And as audio producers and as audio folk, we said, well, we've been doing that for years, decades. We've had these things that are called headphones that you put them directly over your ears and it makes you feel like you're exactly in that world. You just figured out how to do it over your eyes, or we've had surround sound. And so there's a bit of not an advantage or a head start into this immersive world that music and sound effects can do. We've relied on this in movie theaters and home theaters for quite a while, even headphones. So, but your ability for the music to place you there is quite present. The next thing here is music as a pace setter. This is giving a sense of speeding up or slowing down the pace of the game. Racing games do this very, very well. Through the music and the sound effects, you're really trying to give a sense of speed. Sometimes there's something called like bullet time in games, like from the Matrix movies, where everything slows down. The action and sound design really lends to that. All the way back to Super Mario Brothers, where if you get less than 99 seconds remaining in the level, it speeds up and goes da 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 da. Gives you a real sense of you better hurry up or something bad's going to happen if you don't get to the end of the level. Music can do this. Sound effects can do this. Racing games are heavily reliant on the sound of the car engine and the tires and the physics of what the skids and interaction with the road. You do not feel the sense of G-forces or the physics of actually driving a real vehicle. And so to give you as much of that sense as possible, they provide as a really immersive, responsive music and sound effects engine. So music, not only can they do this well with graphics, where they get a sense of motion blur and things seem to speed up, then it gives a really strong way of giving that feel. They did this all the way back to Space Invaders. Space Invaders that had different levels or different difficulties, and really didn't change the game all that much. They just got faster and faster. They just sped up the game. There was a clock going in the game. It's kind of ticking along with the action. And as you go from level 1, 2, 3, and up, it just speeds up the overall graphics, and along with that, the sound effects. There wasn't really music per se. It was a lot of bleeps and bloops. But as those got faster and faster, it really felt like it helped the overall pace of the game. Music as an audience. This is the small rewards and what's the kind of chastising of the player through the music and the sound effects. This is the positive and negative response of the game and the soundtrack of the game in reaction to the player's actions. Puzzle games do this very well. When you are playing Tetris or Bejeweled or what am I playing recently on my phone? If I am playing any number of different puzzle games, they're often things that rise in nature and have kind of a positive major chord that lifts up, or a series of tones that fall down in a minor key, gives the player a positive or negative sense of what they should be doing. So if they screw something up, then let them know. You don't want to make fun of the player. You don't want to annoy them. But you definitely want to, it's a part of the tutorial of how to play the game. If everything sounded happy and good, you would probably not know how to avoid the things that are not the winning part of the game. So all the way, if you go to a Guitar Hero, then you actually have an audience that yells at you and boos and cheers if you're doing well through the game. So there's actually a literal audience that plays right along. But music does this in the sort of natural direction that a lot of games have the idea of an intro, a level loop that plays while the game or while the puzzle is being played, and then a win state or a lose state. Two opportunities of what's going to happen, and maybe some power-ups, or you get the high score, or you lose a life, or you lose some points. Whatever happens in the game, it will kind of reward you or give you a negative response overall. Music as branding. Music in response to the or music that is so well defined and attributed to the game that even separate from the game itself, there is still familiarity with the music soundtrack, right? As all of these go by with the Super Mario Brothers, Metroid, Pokemon, Kirby there, Pokemon, Zelda. All of those might remind you of different classic Nintendo soundtracks. They might still be rolling around in your brain from so many years ago. But that is a bit of it was the early systems were so limited that you heard the same thing over and over again. And that sort of repetition works its way into your memory banks. Or typically shorter game experience where you are doing the same thing over and over again. But certain pieces of music, certain sounds become iconic in relation to the music. You don't necessarily anoint a particular piece of music to say that is ultimately going to be the most popular, well-known part of the game, but it typically reveals itself over time. And this is the opposite. This is sort of the goal that is the opposite of annoying the player. Where you want them to become very familiar with a particular piece of music, but without completely annoying them so that they never want to hear it again. And it's a very fine balance, and it's often a happy reward when you find success with it. All right, next, music as demarcation. There it is. This is using your music and the sound effects to identify very distinct parts of the game or the level. If you are in the evil dragon's cave, or if you are in the king's castle, or if you are in the town pub, or you are on the spaceship, or you are any location in the world, there might be music and sound effects related to that. Earlier games were more heavily based off of levels and screens, which meant there were very well-defined areas that the player walked either up the screen or down or left and right and moved on to the other area. And there were you walked in a door, it was a different part of the game or a different section or part of the map, and they were very well defined and separate. And often you got loading screens where you'd walk from one place to the next and it would say loading while it loaded everything in and out of RAM and got set up for the next screen. Now more modern games have that sort of open world kind of feel where there isn't a start and stop to a level or a screen or to a part of the game. It's just constantly developing, and you can explore in all sorts of different directions. So, but this is the idea of music revolving around a location, where music exists only in a specific place, part of the game world, and it defines that. There is the idea of diegetic and non-diegetic music. This is music that actually exists in the game world, or separately only exists for the player, for the listener. Most music in a film, in a video game, is non-diegetic music. The actual characters do not hear the soundtrack to the movie or to the video game. It's there for the player, for the listener, and it's kind of subtext to the actual experiences going on. Diegetic music will actually exist in the game world. There are speakers, there is some way for the character to actually hear the music. And you can maybe interact with the music, or it actually defines they go into the local town shop and they hear music playing over a speaker. The radio stations in Grand Theft Auto, when you get into all the different cars, you can turn on the radio, switch different stations. That's an example of diegetic music, where it actually exists in the game world for the character to interact with. So, consider locations, worlds, levels, places for your music to exist, and how is it actually used. And very specific to games, music creates immersion, gives the player a sense of belief in what they're doing and what's going on in the game world, that they're actually interacting with that character, that they're actually in that location or world. It's the idea of suspension of disbelief. to give them a sense that they are connected with their experience. As I said, as it moves into virtual reality and AR, if it ever even takes off, who knows? But there's probably a constant push in video games towards more and more immersion, whatever it ends up being. It's using sound without an image. One of the more interesting aspects, or one of the more difficult aspects of audio in general, music and sounds, is that you can't just stop it, pause it, and point at it and go, this is what I'm talking about. It's fleeting. Music has to exist in time versus an image. Even if it's a film or a video game, you can pause it, everybody can look at it, you can rewind it back and say, that's actually what I'm referring to. And audio, there's certain elements of that you can certainly do, but it exists in time, and everything is fleeting. And so you are able to fool our perception and our ears a little bit easier than you can with your eyes. And whatever you are doing with the visuals, you have to make sure that the audio supports that, because it's easier to break realism through what you see, but if your eyes don't match your ears, then it becomes very obvious that it's just a game and it's just a computer, and you're really just in a loop, and you lose that sort of connection with what's actually going on. So it's always a challenge to find that balance overall. All right. So, before we actually get into how things work in the game, we have to talk about some of the limitations of what is actually possible. We talked a little bit about the history of audio for video games, and so some of those limitations, or the limitations, are constantly becoming less and less of a limitation as more power, computing systems, more processing power, more RAM, more hard drive space, all of this stuff becomes available, so we can just do more stuff. Things become faster, things become better looking and better sounding, but we just constantly fill up disks and hard drives and processors with faster and faster and more stuff. So there is always limitations, and understanding what those limitations, and often actually having those limitations, will make your life a bit easier. Well, not easier, but maybe a bit more well-defined. So let's talk about some of the different aspects, and this is kind of the reality check of working in games, because not only are you doing everything in all of the audio, but you're also generating the visuals in real time, and the graphics and the images and the motion in the game. And so there's a lot of things going on simultaneously. And a lot of this kind of relates back to how things might work in your DAW. Very familiar concepts overall. Hold on just a second. Let me take a quick pause here. All right. So if you've ever loaded up a large Logic session, you have run into this issue, the limited amount of RAM. And as people's laptops get more and more powerful, I certainly started off with 1 gigabyte, then 2, then 4, and then I'm at either 8, I think I'm at 8 now, gigabytes of RAM. there's a limit of how much stuff you can load up at any one time. So games have had a limitation of how much RAM is available to load up all of the graphics and also all of the sounds. When you load up a piano inside of Contact, it has to load up all of the individual samples for all 88 keys at many different velocity levels. There's a lot of different samples, a lot of different wave files, and all of that occupy or can occupy RAM. And RAM is the sound that needs to be available instantly, or let's say the other way. If a sound needs to be available instantly, it needs to be loaded up into RAM. Meaning that if you need to click a button and you need to hear a jump sound, or you need to hear a punch sound, or a gunshot sound, or whatever immediately, then that sound needs to be loaded into RAM because it's very, very fast to be able to retrieve and play back the audio file. But there is limitations overall. The original Sega Genesis, all of the audio was occupied 32 kilobytes worth of RAM. Most of your favorite PlayStation 2 and Xbox games and all those, all of the audio existed in 2 megabytes worth of RAM, and that's not everything. That's only at one time. So the entire disk can have 650 megabytes worth of stuff, but at any one time it was only a couple of megabytes. And your phones, now mobile devices, tablets, and all that are about, I don't know, 8 to 10 years back in technology, and the amount of hard drive space and RAM and processor available, and it allows you, if you're doing a mobile game, which a lot of times when you're starting out, those are the types of games you are working on, you still encounter a lot of these limitations, which means that you can't have massively large files or massively large sessions eating up a whole bunch of RAM to play back audio in your game. You have to have some sort of a discussion with the game developers of, okay, how much audio, how much space can I take up with all of my audio? How much is it going to fit? How is it going to load and unload while we're playing the game? So this kind of all is kind of encompassed by the idea of a memory footprint. This is the amount of RAM that is necessary to play audio at any point in the game. So whenever, at any point in the timeline of your game, how much RAM do you need for your audio? When you are bouncing out your WAV files, they take up megabytes worth of space. Well, maybe you do not have, if you have 100 files loaded or 1,000 files loaded for a particular game level, you may not have all of that amount of space. And so we reduce the number of channels, we go down to mono files, we go down to reduce the sample rate and the bit depth, and it's all the balance to make sure it works. And the Xbox has its own audio format that allows files to be compressed. The PlayStation has its own file formats that allows the audio to be compressed, sort of like an MP3 file, where it's reduced in quality and reduced in file size. They don't, I mean, PlayStation and Xbox can play MP3 files, but that's not the best format to use for your quick firing game overall. So there's the limitation of overall hard drive or disk space. We thought at some point that there would never need to be a reason that our games would ever be beyond a couple of megabytes on a cartridge. Early games were a couple of 100 kilobytes. The whole game, music, sound effects, graphics, gameplay, everything. In fact, they put Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt all together. I've heard recently that if you took one copy of all of the original printed Nintendo games and put them all together, it would fit about 250 megabytes. And if you took all of one copy of all of the original PlayStation games, it would be less than filling up a single PlayStation 4 500 gigabyte hard drive. So the amount of space that we have ballooned to is pretty interesting between all of the different generations and game consoles and whatnot. So we just fill it with larger and larger files, or more and more stuff. And we music composers are some of the worst offenders of this because our music is are really big fat files. They take up a lot of space. They are compared to graphics. The all of the graphics that you see in the game are not rendered until the game is being played. So there's a lot of textures and models and animations and materials and the single components, pieces and parts, but the whole scenes that you see that play out over minutes and hours don't exist until the game is being played. And so they're very processor intensive to render all of that stuff, but they don't necessarily take up tons of space. But if we come in and we have 10 hours of music and we think it's going to be 24-bit 96 and it's 5.1 surround sound files, we're going to eat up a whole bunch of file space because the game isn't doing anything with our music much other than playing it in the correct way. So what I'm saying is that music takes up a whole bunch of space, or can take up a whole bunch of space, along with like dialogue, recorded scripts. If my game is 10 hours worth of content and there's 300 page long or 500 page long script of branching interactive dialogue that needs to be recorded in 7 different languages to be released all over the world, that takes up a whole lot of space. So one example is the Halo 3 game when it was released for Xbox 360. This is Halo 3. It was put on a DVD disc, which is 4.9 gigabytes, right? Almost 5 gigs. The entire audio, all of the audio, music, dialogue, sound effects for that game existed in 9 gigabytes. So just the audio for the game, not the actual game itself, just the audio was twice as big as the entire rest of the game, or the entire disc that it was supposed to be on. So, like I said, Xbox has its own compression format, similar to MP3 files or FLAC files or OGG Vorbis files. Its own format called XMA, Xbox Media Audio, and it has anywhere between 2 to 1 to 20 to 1 compression ratios. So they chose 10 to 1. So that means they had 9 gigabytes. Let's say they had 10 gigabytes of audio files. That goes down and gets shrunk down to 1 gigabyte of audio because of the compression. There's a little bit of audio quality loss, but overall sounds pretty good, especially for the savings. So now all of the audio only exists on 1 gigabyte. That leaves 3 gigabytes left for the rest of the game, or whatever, 4 gigabytes almost, because it's almost 5 gigs on a DVD, and it gives you all the space that you need. So so we did cartridges for a while. We did DVDs. Now the PlayStation and now Xbox have Blu-ray discs that go up to 50 gigabytes. We have hard drives that are terabytes big. Now with online distribution, download, you can get games that are much bigger than 50 gigabytes, but they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So it is a reality, and we'll just keep filling up larger and larger files, larger and larger discs and hard drives. Our last limitation here is a limited audio system. We have to be aware that everybody is not playing back our music on the most stellar audio systems. Unlike movies, movies are mixed for and in a movie theater for other movie theaters. And a game can be played on an amazing high-end home theater system. It can be played on little small computer speakers that you get with your new computer, played on headphones, earbuds, played out of the mono speaker out of a television. It can be really good or probably more than likely pretty bad, where your music and your sound effects are not going to be heard on a system that's going to be better than your home studio setup. So you have to consider that if you're making a mobile game and it's probably going to be heard on earbuds or out of the little mono or stereo speakers out of the phone on the hardware, you may not want to put a whole bunch of bass in your music because it will not play back or not come through to the player all that well. Now just consider the final playback, the final medium. A lot of games can actually remix all of this stuff in real time. So where you can go from mono to stereo to 5.1, you can indicate some games have dynamic response in them. So if you're playing in the middle of the night, that allows you to compress everything and turn it down. Or if you're playing in the middle of the day and you want to crank it up, you have a large dynamic range and it sounds amazing. You can switch between saying you're playing on headphones versus you're playing on speakers, and the actual, it'll change the mix. It'll change the compression. It'll change the volume mix. It'll change the spread of the speakers between 45 degrees and 90 or 180 degrees for headphones. There's all sorts of considerations in how it's played back, so you have to consider what the final format's going to be. All right. The next topic here, building music for the game. So this is getting into how the music is going to work, how it's actually used. Once we have a folder filled with all of these WAV files, what does the game do with it? How does it know? What are the basic blocks that we use to build up the full soundtrack for the completed game? So let me take another quick pause here before we get into this. Okay. Next, we will start out with linear loops. This is probably the most core component of your interactive music system. It is a looping file. The opposite of a looping file is a file that does not loop and just plays one time. That is, let's say, like iTunes or just a music player. That is not very interactive. It starts at the beginning of the file, plays through, stops when it gets to the end, and it's done. There's no interactivity to it at that level, at least. And it's not a very common way of dealing with the interactive nature of a game. A loop allows you to stay in one place musically, waiting for something to happen in the game before logically transitioning on to the next idea or the next part of the soundtrack. So our loops are giving us the period of time where we don't know what's going to happen, where that interactivity is happening. As soon as you give the player a controller, all bets are off. You don't know what's going to happen. So this is allowing you to musically stay in one place. Lots of games rely on longer linear compositions, minutes long. I definitely want to express and get the point across that our loops in our games are very, very short. I don't want you going through the class or getting to the end thinking that massive big games are made up of just a whole bunch of 8-bar and 16-bar loops. You have hours worth of music that's just made of 8-bar loops. This is going to, that would cause a lot of changes, a lot of unnecessary headaches. A much longer game experience will give you minutes of time to explore new ideas, change tempos and keys, and just change style and whatever your progression and whatever your idea is, and move off to somewhere else before it loops back around and comes back to where it starts. So games use 1 minute, 3, 5 minute, or longer compositions or phrases that can then move and transition from one to the next. Just the main thing, though, is that these are long pieces, are built to loop once the end is reached and transition to the next place. The movement from one to the next and how the end of your file coincides or connects back to the front of the file, that is really going to be your challenge. Once the loop is playing here in the middle, that's a pretty easy place to be, because that's where you composed it and it's just kind of following along with whatever music you made. But how it ties from beginning to end and from one to the next becomes a little bit more difficult. So linear loops are often used during times of long exploration, level loops, puzzle solving. If you don't know what the player is doing or where they are or where they're going to be or how long anything's going to take, then a loop works out pretty well because you can kind of sit there and wait. Sometimes you have to wait quite a while, and if your loop is a minute long or even if it's longer than that, the player can take minutes or 10 minutes to 15, 20 minutes to figure out what to do next or how to get to the next part. And so your 3 or 4 minute long loop is going to go around and around and around. So some games have something called a board switch. And a board switch is if the music is repeating and going around and around, at some point we don't want it to hear the same piece of music play yet again. So we've played through this third time, we're heading into the fourth, maybe we don't want to repeat again. So they'll have this board switch, which will just switch the music off. It'll fade out, it'll fade to silence, and at that point you just hear sound effects. You don't want to annoy the player, they've heard it already, so let's just fade it out. You'll hear ambiences, you hear Foley, you'll hear the breathing of the character, but it's not going to play that piece of music yet again. And then you turn the corner, you find the next part of the storyline, and the music swells back in like it was supposed to be there the entire time. So this board switch, a lot of Nintendo games were good at this, where Mario would just kind of sit down and read a book or go to sleep. Zelda would just sit there and do something, wait until you actually did something, and then move along. Lots of different ways to create loops that help out this process. If you create a piece of music and you can only think about it in one context, in only one linear progression, and any way that it can't come back around to the front or can't be taken apart and reworked into some other way, it's probably not going to be very useful in games. You want to have almost like musical Legos that can kind of be stuck together in different shapes and forms and taken apart and re-put back together in new ways. And lots of different approaches in doing this for your loop. Of course, the most strongest way or best way of creating a loop is thinking that you're ahead of time about creating and composing a loop and doing it in the actual composition phase. If you are writing a piece of music with the intention that it's going to loop, then you can reach the end and make sure it ties nicely back to the front. But a lot of times music is just written for music's sake, to generate ideas and then go back and edit it and cut it down so that it actually loops and fits into a game. And so having real obvious points where something could switch or change or loop in the original composition is going to make that make that process a bit easier. Your choice of instrumentation, instruments with low instrumentation in the lower range, along with long sustained pads and drones and choirs or something like that, make it a bit more difficult to loop. Anything with a really obvious attack, the elements in the lower ranges with longer waveforms become a bit more difficult to edit without a pop or a click. So your choice of instrumentation, typically things that are faster and plucky and more bouncy, are going to work a bit better for looping. But you can pretty much make anything loop if set up for it. Fades, sometimes you need to rise up in intensity and then kind of return back down in creating this loop. You don't want just a general direction that rises and rises and rises and never comes back to return back for the loop. So how things build and how things crescendo, decrescendo through your piece of music, rise and fall, will really help in creating a loop out of that piece of music. Rhythmic elements, strong drums, downbeats, all of that will make crash cymbals make a pretty strong, obvious kind of signpost as to where a loop might happen. Effects, sometimes you can just throw the music into a whole bunch of effects, and it gets into reverb and delays and filters, and it gets all weird sounding, and you kind of lose the direction of the music. Maybe there's a strong rhythm. DJs will do this a lot, where there's a real strong rhythm on one turntable, and then they'll throw the music into a whole bunch of effects and a whole bunch of weird sounds and kind of lose the rhythm, but still have stuff going on, and so they can mix into the next record, which was at a completely different tempo. So using effects to not go fully to silence or to fully tail out, but using that to create points that lose where the loop exists. And then editing, we did a lot of different techniques in the first week with your looping exercise that pointed out a couple of different approaches to just editing, directly editing loops. Another core component of our music system would be the one-shot. And one-shots are the opposite of a loop. They aren't necessarily part of a static music system or something like iTunes that doesn't really change or do anything, because they can still be interactive and trigger according to the action going on in the game. But a one-shot just means it doesn't loop. It only plays once. And any sound that doesn't loop is called a one-shot. And there are different categories of one-shots or different ways of thinking about them. Stingers are one-shots, but not all one-shots are stingers. Stingers are typically there to provide information or attention or add sort of emphasis to a particular idea or action in the game. Here in the picture, we've got our hero exploring through the level. You hear exploration music. Let's say this is a 3-minute long music loop that just kind of goes around while they're exploring through the world. Then they find the secret treasure, or they find the power-up, and all of a sudden there's a Found It stinger that plays. It's typically not in any sort of key or doesn't necessarily have to match the music. You just don't want it to horribly not match or clash. But like when you open a treasure chest, or you find a secret doorway, or there's a little bit of a flourish of sound or music that kind of tells you, hey, you did a good job. Or if you find a power-up and you go in for the next 20 seconds, you go into berserk mode and you can just cause all sorts of mayhem and damage through the game world. Maybe that is a stinger or one-shot. It plays one time. It's 20 seconds long. You know exactly how long this action or event's going to last, so you write a corresponding piece of music for it. Sometimes it's musical. A lot of times it's musical. That's what we had in Angry Bots, as you were going back and forth between ambient and action to go from the less intense ambient cue to the stronger action cue, and to kind of hide that sudden transition, you have stingers. And stingers will allow you to musically move from one thing to the next, hopefully a little bit easier. But they can also be sound design. If you go into the spooky dungeon or castle and you hear ghost voices all over the place, maybe you create 10 ghost voices and have them randomly generate around your scary room, and they will play at different times in different locations and give you a sense that maybe it's surrounding you, and it plays in surround sound and it moves all over the place and sounds creepy and immersive. Or if you go into a cave and there's cave drips all over the place, you could go to the bathtub and create 10 different drips and just record 10 of them in a line and then loop those 10 drips around and around and around. but it'll be the same 10 drips around, going in circles, and it'll be quite obvious. So instead, you chop up those 10 drips into individual files, and then tell the game each time you play, randomly play one of these drips and change their pitch and their timing and their volume with each individual drip. You will get a lot more randomization. That's how they do it with repeating sounds, with footsteps, with gunshots, with a lot of Foley sounds. They're just a lot of randomization that is taking a small bank of 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 sounds, similar sounds, and then just randomizing them to make it almost sound like an infinite amounts of variation. Stingers, embellishment, emphasis to kind of point to an action that said, hey, this is good or bad, and it helps to hide the musical transitions. Lots of different uses. So between your loops and between your one-shots, you have a lot of the core elements that are going to create your soundtrack. One-shots work for puzzles, power-ups, secrets, environments, all sorts of different ways that you can interact with the sound. All right. The next one here really gets into how does the game know how to switch from one file to the next. We know, and we created music so that when 2D platformer starts, you have intro files, and the main character, the bean, drops down, and intro cue starts. It plays for 2 bars. The game knows nothing about your music, doesn't know what's contained in it. All it knows is how long that file is and when it stops. And then when it does stop, how does the game know how to go from intros to main loops and then randomize between the main loops? And then eventually you lose all of your health points or lose a life, and it goes to the ending state. How does it know when to switch and transition? So this is all going to be based off of game states, and I have a very poor definition for game states. My English teacher always told me that you do not use the words that you're trying to define in the definition that you're actually creating. So here's my bad definition of game states. They are the state the game is in at any one time. It is what is going on in the game at that one moment. If we could kind of freeze frame it at any millisecond in time and take an inventory of what's going on. Where's the good guy? Where's the bad guys? How many bad guys? What's everybody's health? What is everybody's weapon that they're using? Who's shooting at who? Who's aiming? Who hit who? How many health points does that take away? Who's got the high score? Who's got the fastest time at every single millisecond along in the game? Games will run at typically 30 frames per second. The frame rates, you've probably learned a bit about frame rates from your post-production class, talking about how film and works and film audio works together. And film runs at 24 frames per second. Color television runs at 29.9 frames per second, 29.97 frames per second. And games run anywhere typically between 30 frames or upwards of 60 frames a second, or even faster than that. The PlayStation really touts the fact that they run at 60 frames per second. So that means let's just take 30 frames per second. Very common for our eyes to perceive motion at 30 frames per second. So 30 times per second, the game is drawing something on the screen. And in between that 1/30th of a second, in between when it draws something on the screen, it has to figure out everything that has happened in the game at that time. So the game starts, it draws an image on the screen, something happens in the game, and 30 times per second, it draws something, figures out what has happened, who's got the score, who's in the lead, what happens with the music. And then if it needs to, it switches and changes everything in real time, then draws it on the screen again and does this at 30 frames per second, and it feels like we're playing a video game. So at any one moment in time, we can basically ask a question that says, hey, do we need to switch and change our music? When we're playing 2D platformer, the game starts and the computer says, hey, the game has started. And so the game says, okay, we need to play an intro piece of music. Let's choose one of these 3 intro pieces of music and play it. Okay, so game starts, plays the music, plays it until the end of the file. The game only knows when the file's over. There's nothing more to play. It's done. So then the computer says, okay, the file is done. What do we do now? The game looks at the code and says, okay, well, we need to choose one of these 3 main loops. And here they are in this folder. We're going to randomly choose one. Okay, here's main loop 2. Go play that. And the computer goes, okay, plays main loop 2, plays it until the end of that file, comes back and says, okay, what do we need to do now? And at 60 times per second, the computer is, or the game is asking, okay, are we done playing the intro? 60 times or 30 times per second, the computer goes, nope, we're not done. 30 times per second, it's asking, hey, is this file completed, or have we lost all of our health points? The game says, nope, we haven't done that, asks over and over and over again, and then finally, eventually, the answer will be yes. The game will ask the computer, hey, is this a main loop file done playing? And the computer will go, yes, actually, it's done playing. So the game goes, okay, now it tells us we need to choose another one, or we need to play the ending at some point. So these game states are basically the questions that are asked at 30 times per second, or at the frame rate, or sometimes even faster than that, to basically drive and change what's going on in the game. And we can basically define anything to be a game state. Game states aren't anything. They're just an idea or a concept that we can kind of attach our music to. Intros, main loops, and endings are game states. They're not anything other than some WAV files that you created. And really, they're not even the WAV files. They're just the concept or idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end. Ambient and action are game states. Score, health, time. These are very, very common game states in games. Hey, you got the highest score, or you are low on health. So we switch over to low health music, and we hear that until you go and get more health, and then boom, it switches back. Fastest time or the slowest time in the game. These are all game states that can switch and change the music and the audio as it is played. So game states, you won't have to do much with game states actually in the computer, except for coming up with all the ideas. If you say you want to battle the enemy, okay, we got this big boss battle at the end, so I want to walk through this door and the monster jumps out, and then I hear battle level 1 music and I fight the monster. I hear battle level 2 music, I fight the monster. Battle level 3, and then eventually I'm going to either win or lose. So I need to write win music, I need to write lose music. These are very common setups or processes in a game. So you write for all of those pieces and parts during that battle scene. All of those, the monster reveal, battle level 1, battle level 2, battle level 3, win, lose, all of those are game states. They're just concepts or ideas that revolve around the music that we want to create. So we go off and we write all of the music for all of those pieces and parts of the soundtrack. And then the game developers go into the game, they go into the code, and they say, well, if you enter this area, then the monster jumps out. And if you hit the monster 3 times, then it goes from battle level 1 to battle level 2 music. If you hit him 3 more times, it goes from 2 to 3, and then eventually you hit him the last time, and you either go to win or lose. So all of those, they go off and they put it into the game. You go off and you make awesome music. You come back together, and as long as your WAV files are all set up correctly, named properly, and in the right folder, the next time the game plays, it should actually see how it. You should actually see how it works in the game. So game states are the ideas and the hooks. Sometimes we call them hooks or triggers or states that will actually trigger something to happen. the game state is more about the switching from one to the next and how do we move and transition. Again, once or while the music is being played, there's not that much interactivity going on. But once you hit that point of switching from one to the next, that becomes more of the interactivity and the actual challenge in the soundtrack of the game. So we're going to talk about two approaches for music functioning in the game. And we already use both of these approaches in our current game projects. And they tie into different game states and how the music is actually triggered to shift and change and transition over time. But again, let me take another quick pause before I get into this last topic, or last two topics, I guess. Hold on just a sec. All right. So, the terminology here, horizontal resequencing, vertical layering, there's some long words for some pretty straightforward concepts that we've already been using in our games. They are the basics of how most games operate in two general approaches. And actually, the reality is most games just use a combination of both of these at different times. So, we're going to start out here with horizontal resequencing. And let me jump over to logic here. When I say, and I often just refer to this as horizontal composition or horizontal music system, horizontal and vertical orchestration or instrumentation or composition, or basically the horizontal and vertical part are the more important aspects of those terms. So whenever I refer to a horizontal music system, what I am referring to, or you can imagine or picture in your head, a single stereo track in your DAW. Let's make this actually a software instrument track. So think about a single stereo track in your DAW. And on that single stereo track, there are multiple different cues or multiple different regions. If I, let's see, there one is going to be green, and one will be red, and one will be yellow. Oof, it's an ugly yellow. And one will be blue. Okay. So, when you are thinking about a horizontal music system, think about a single stereo track in your DAW with multiple different regions on them. As your timeline progresses, you only hear one of these at a time, and then as it moves on to the next one, switches over and plays the next file. Only one plays at a time. The entire stereo mix needs to be heard in these files because you're only playing one file at a time. So drums, bass, harmony, melody, everything needs to be contained, the full stereo mix in these files. And then the game rearranges them in different orders to create all of the different variations in the soundtrack that you need. So let me jump over here. The different colored blocks represent different game states, and they represent different WAV files, different cues that are attached to those game states. So intro, action, power up, low health, death. This is common, similar to Angry Bots in how it may switch and transition. So, like I said, the game is constantly asking, at what point did we start? Okay, once we started, then when is this file over? Once it's over, then it determines to switch over to action. Most of the gameplay, you hear the action cue, but eventually you might pick up a power-up. And for the next 30 seconds, you're invisible, and so you can run around the map and nobody can find you. And then it eventually wears off, and you go back to the action cue. This power-up can be a one-shot piece of music, just plays once, but the action cue loops around and around as it goes. Low health, a lot of games, if you get below 10% health, you hear a heartbeat, or the screen flashes red, or you hear a filter across everything, or it gets kind of weird sounding. Then kind of encourages you to go get some more health. It goes back above 10%, and you start hearing the original or action music again. Eventually, you lose all of the health, and you go to the death game state. This is a one-shot also. It plays one time, ends, resolves to a finish, so that it can just jump back over to intro and start the whole process over again. So the main thing here is one piece of music at a time. The entire stereo mix needs to be contained in it, and the music needs to be set up so that it can be shuffled and rearranged into any sort of order. All of our games so far, 2D platformer and Angry Bots, use this horizontal setup. In both 2D platformer and Angry Bots, you never hear more than one file at the same time. Well, it's not entirely true. In Angry Bots, you hear a crossfade as it goes from ambient action back to ambient. So maybe sometimes you hear a crossfade as it goes from one to the next, but primarily you are hearing one file at a time. So it helps to keep them all in the same key, helps to keep them all at the same tempo, so that it feels like a similar song as it jumps around and shuffles into any sort of order that you want. If you have a better idea of what is going to happen in your game and in what order, then maybe a horizontal music system works. Because it's almost like breadcrumbs. You can kind of feed the player the correct piece of music as you are leading them through the game. You know as they cross from point A to point B that it shifts from one piece of music to the next. Or if a very specific event happens in the game, then it might shift the music also. The horizontal music system, as it moves from one to the next, the most default way it's going to be set up is that it's not going to have any understanding of your music, and it's just going to hard cut from one thing to the next. Just like if you go over to your DAW here and you play through one, when you reach the end of one and jumps to the other, it just stops playing this one and jumps over to the next file. The game knows nothing about your music, the tempo, the time signature, how many bars or beats are in a particular file. So that requires a little bit more understanding by the game. Somebody actually has to go in and program the game to count bars and beats and to understand the tempo of the music and understand how to switch and change between all of them. That makes a little more sense. And lots of games do this, but it's a much more specific kind. Much more specific kind of setup. It's kind of like waiting to get off the highway, right? In a hard cut, as it switches from one thing to the next, it's like you didn't even wait for the exit. All right, we're gonna go from ambient to action. Doesn't matter where we are. We're just gonna take a hard right, and we're gonna go off into the median. Or it's like waiting for the actual highway exit. Right now, we need to teach the game to count bars and beats. We can say, all right, every bar, 2 bars, 4 bars is a logical place to transition from this piece of music to the next piece of music. Now we safely get off the exit ramp, and it makes a whole lot more sense as it's being played back. So again, this uses multiple themes, fully mixed. Each theme replaces the one before it, shuffles, it changes, but you need to have drums, bass, harmony, and melody. Then, a very popular alternative to the horizontal music system is a vertical music system. Vertical music systems are a bit more modern and advanced. Horizontal music systems have been around since the dawn of games because you could only play one file at a time. All they could do is, if it played from one thing to the next, then you stopped one thing and moved on to the next one. There was no even crossfades or overlap. You could only play one at a time. But the problem with a horizontal music system is you're either going to get that hard cut, which may not be desirable, or you're going to have to wait for the correct bar or beat to switch the music, which sometimes if it's a short distance, then no problem. But if the only way that you can transition out of this music is 10 or 20 or 30 or a minute later, 60 seconds later, then you might cause an issue waiting for it, where this amazing event happens in the game and then the music reacts to it 15 seconds later. That may not be very desirable at all. So a vertical music system will allow you to introduce any piece of music at any time, and it will always make sense. That's the approach that we are using for Palace of Vernthalion for this week. So when you visualize, or when you hear the word vertical music system or vertical layering of your music, then you can imagine a multi-track DAW session, but this time the files are vertically laid out, kind of one on top of each other. This is what is meant by a vertical music system. We are very familiar with this. This is just the same as a multi-track DAW session, where we have multiple tracks. They're all in the same key. They're all in the same tempo. They're all in the same progression. And they're all going to fit together because they follow the same basic outline. And then you can turn on or off any of these files as needed. You just fade it in and out. Even if it's in the middle of some musical phrase, you can still fade it in at the correct time. It will always be in sync. You need to make sure that all of these files, when they start at the beginning, they start at the same time, they end at the same time, and they're all set up to loop together. It does take a little bit more setup a little bit more involved setup to get going with it. Let's see, let's jump back over here. So with a vertical music system, this allows you to introduce a new piece of music at any time, and you are basically building and breaking back down tension and intensity in the music. With each new layer, you often add a new element of pacing or stronger instrumentation so that it becomes a more and more dense piece of music. These are game states at the bottom. Ambient, proximity, close, action, break, action, cooldown. You can see different layers come in and out and play together and separately at different times. So it ultimately, just like a multi-track session, it's just like one ongoing piece of music with multiple individual layers or stems that can play back together in any sort of combination to create the final version of it. Each new layer is faded in on top of the others, often used in open world games. So if you have less of an idea of what's going to happen, of where they're going to be, how they're going to get there, how long it's going to take them to get there, then a vertical music system might do a whole lot better for you, because you can just wait around in the music loop as it goes around and around. Some event happens in the game and the music reacts to it and plays back correctly. Fantasy and horror games are very good at these, or this is very useful for those types of games. Fantasy games mostly because they are very, very large and you have no idea in which direction they are going to head. You just know when they're going to get there, they're going to hear the correct piece of music. Horror games are all about intensity and pacing and tension. And a vertical music system can work well with this because it can add layer by layer and keep building that amount of tension till it breaks, until you have the action. So in a horror game, you might have these 5 different game states, 5 different layers of interactivity to the music. Ambient represents the The player is safe at this point, whether they know it or not. Maybe they're not aware of it, but there is no monster out there. There is no bad guy. They are safely roaming around the world. Proximity is, again, whether they know it or not, the enemy's somewhere nearby. Maybe they know it and they're trying to hide. Maybe the enemy knows it and it's trying to hide. But they're just in the general proximity of each other. Close. Now this is the peak of the tension. They are right around the corner from each other. The player is hiding, making sure that they don't get caught. The close becomes the peak of your mix, where the most instrumentation, the most pacing and timing is being created. And so once you hit that close, this is where when the monster jumps out, the action breaks loose, action comes in, maybe the drums hit, the bass hits, and you reach the full battle in the game. Then at some point you win or you lose. Either the monster defeats you or you defeat the monster, and there is a cooldown phase. If you defeat the monster, maybe you run away long enough to get away from the monster. You can't just drop back down to ambient. It has to fall back steadily. So you have to go through this cooldown phase where the instrumentation recedes back a little bit, drums kind of calm down, bass line calms down, everything returns back to ambient so that it can build right back up again. Utilizes one ongoing loop. Each layer must work well with all of the other layers. Keep in the same key, same tempo to make sure all loops work together. We discussed this heavily, this idea of making sure there's no clashing, no dissonance, making sure that all of the layers work together when building this composition. There are two different approaches to a vertical music system. And both are beneficial in their own ways. An additive system, like I just described with a horror game, where each layer is based off the layer previous. So you have layer 1, 2, and 3. It builds up 1, 2, and 3, and then it recedes back down 3, 2, 1. When you start the game, ambient plays. Then when you get to proximity, proximity will always be played with ambient. Then you get to close. Close will always be played with proximity and ambient. Action plays. That plays with close, proximity, and ambient. So with each layer, the previous layer before it always works. This gives you less combinations, or just one real obvious combination, up and down. But you can rely on the previous tracks. Like there's always the ambient cue has a really cool low bass sound. Well, that's just always going to be there as it builds up and back down. So it adds or stacks the tracks on top of each other. The other one is interchange. It doesn't rely on a constant bed. You are not always guaranteed that ambient's going to be there. This is how the Palace of Renthalion works. They can turn on and off earth, wind, fire, and water in any sort of order, any sort of combination, so you're not always guaranteed that that previous one is going to be playing with you. This gives you the most options, the most variations, because it becomes, at least these, 5 to the nth power. So you have so many different variations with each new additional layer. So it gives you more variations, but you have less reliance on whatever the music's going to be. And we talked a bit about how you might set up and build this sort of composition where our Palace of Renthalion composition this week utilizes a vertical music system, and you have to create 4 individual music cues that need to be able to play on their own separately, but also play together in the same key and the same tempo. One of the best approaches to building this type of soundtrack or this type of composition is a top-down approach, where if you start building up layer by layer, instrument by instrument, making sure that every brass, string, or woodwind works with every other instrument before it, you can easily run out of options or run out of ideas or repeat yourself or create clashing or dissonance or any sort of harmonic or melodic errors or issues. So instead of a top bottom up approach, layer by layer, building up to the composition, a top down approach doesn't concern itself with the instrumentation. Don't worry about how it's going to fit and how it's going to loop. All you're going to worry about is the composition itself, the notes. So start out on a piano. Works well to give you instrumentation in the, or give you a range in the lower registers, mids, and highs. And you can start writing chord progressions and melodies, and you can start generating the voices and the notes that work well in your composition. So you build your chord progression, you build your series of melodies that work against that chord progression, and then you start concerning yourself with instrumentation, orchestration, arrangement, formatting, looping, bouncing, mixing, all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of the forest for the trees approach. Don't get lost in the forest and get lost in the individual tracks and details. Worry about the overall composition first, and that will kind of direct you into how your final game composition might work for a vertical music system. All right. Well, lots of different topics today, lots of different ideas and approaches, but we really got into how the game itself knows how to switch and change the music. What is the function of the music in the game? What are some of the restrictions that we have in reality of working with them? But then the basic building blocks of linear loops and one-shots. And then we get into more of the interactive nature of a horizontal music system or a vertical music system that our 2D platformer and Angry Bots are using this horizontal music system. Our Palace of Renthalion game is going to utilize a vertical music system. So it really dictates how your compositions are built and formatted and bounced, ready to go. So next week, Tuesday, we'll do more feedback and peer review, talk about how the assignments work in the last week. And then on Thursday, next Thursday, we'll get into more of the technology of how your music actually works its way into the game, the software, the techniques, the process, the workflow involved in all of that. And we'll also get into how you can take everything that you've learned and kind of relay that and create demo reels, portfolios to show off your work in a game to future clients or employers. So we will talk about all sorts of great resources to get yourself started beyond this class and into the games industry as a music composer. So let's go ahead and wrap it up there for our Thursday afternoon. Let me know if you have any questions. So stick around after the class or send me an email before the end of Friday so that we can address any sort of issues, hopefully that you might encounter before the weekend. But other than that, I will see you again on on Tuesday, and you have a nice weekend. All right, thanks a lot.